Welcome to an unprecedented look at our legal system. What you are about to witness is completely unfiltered and unedited. Prepare yourself for raw, authentic footage captured directly from the front lines of justice, where truth is the only objective.
You don't think your damn military medals make you better than me. You sit there thinking you're untouchable because you're black and got a fancy uniform.
Everything legally required, sir. Every document's valid. Every command follows.
You're abusing authority because of who I am, not what I am.
The sheriff's hand moved to his weapon before the Navy SEAL could even finish his sentence. One moment, Lieutenant Commander James Rees was explaining why his temporary registration was perfectly legal. The next, he was staring down the barrel of department-issued authority backed by nothing but assumption and ego. What happened in the following 11 minutes would cost Brazos County more than their entire annual budget and end a 23-year law enforcement career in disgrace. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to someone like James. Not on a random Tuesday afternoon on State Highway 21. James had been driving back from visiting his mother in Houston. She'd just turned 70, and he'd spent the weekend helping her reorganize the garage, fix a leaking faucet, and listen to stories about his late father. Standard son duties. He was tired but content, looking forward to getting back to base in San Diego. His truck was new, purchased just 2 weeks earlier from a dealership in Virginia near his previous duty station. The temporary tags were clearly visible in the rear window, valid for another 45 days. Sheriff Clayton Briggs saw something else entirely. Briggs had been with the department since he was 21 years old, worked his way up from deputy to sheriff through what he called old-fashioned police work. Others might call it something different. His record showed a pattern of stops concentrated in specific neighborhoods, targeting specific demographics. 17 formal complaints over 2 decades, all dismissed or marked as unfounded. The system had protected him perfectly until the moment he decided to pull over the wrong person on the wrong day with a dashcam recording every second. The initial stop seemed routine enough. Briggs activated his lights and James pulled over immediately, hands visible on the steering wheel before the sheriff even approached. Textbook compliance. James had been through this before, more times than he cared to count. He knew the script by heart. But Briggs wasn't following any script. The sheriff approached the driver's side window with his hand already resting on his holster. Not hovering near it, actually resting on it, fingers drumming against the leather. James noticed immediately. His training kicked in, the same heightened awareness that had kept him alive during 3 combat deployments in hostile territories. This wasn't standard procedure. This was a man looking for confrontation. License and registration. The words came out flat, no courtesy, no explanation for the stop. James handed over his military ID along with his driver's license. He explained about the temporary registration, pointed to the clearly visible documentation in the rear window. He kept his voice calm, professional, exactly how the Navy had trained him to handle tense situations. Diffuse, don't escalate. Provide information, maintain respect, follow protocol. Briggs barely glanced at the military ID before handing it back. He focused entirely on the temporary registration paperwork, studying it like it was written in code. James watched the sheriff's expression shift from scrutiny to something else. Not confusion, determination. The look of someone who'd already decided how this would end and was now just finding justification. The temporary tag looked suspicious. Briggs' voice had changed, harder now, accusatory. James felt his stomach tighten. Suspicious how? The paperwork was legitimate, issued by a licensed Virginia dealership, completely legal under federal interstate commerce regulations. Thousands of people drove through Texas every day with similar documentation. That's when Briggs asked James to step out of the vehicle. No reasonable officer makes that request during a routine traffic stop for a documentation check. James knew it. Briggs knew it. But Briggs had a badge and a gun and 23 years of getting away with exactly this kind of behavior. James had military training, combat experience, and the knowledge that one wrong move could end with him bleeding out on Texas asphalt while his mother wondered why he never made it home. He stepped out of the truck. The dashcam captured everything in crystalline detail. James, standing with his hands clearly visible, speaking in measured tones, explaining his military service, his recent purchase of the vehicle, the complete legitimacy of his documentation. Briggs, circling like a predator, finding fault with everything. The way James was standing, the tone of his voice, the fact that he was asking questions about why this stop was necessary. "You're being uncooperative." Briggs said it loud enough for the dash cam to catch every syllable. The accusation was absurd on its face. James had complied with every single request, provided every document asked for, maintained perfect composure despite increasingly hostile treatment. But Briggs needed James to be uncooperative, needed him to be a threat, because what came next required justification. Briggs called for backup. Within 6 minutes, 2 additional patrol units arrived. Neither deputy had any idea what they were responding to. Dispatch had reported a suspicious vehicle stop with an uncooperative driver. They pulled up expecting potential danger, and instead found a Navy SEAL standing next to his truck with perfect military posture, speaking respectfully to their sheriff, surrounded by documentation proving he'd done nothing wrong. Deputy Angela Martinez arrived first. 15-year veteran, solid record, no complaints. She immediately sensed something wasn't right about this situation. The second deputy, rookie officer named Kyle Chen, was too new to question anything. He just took position where Briggs directed him. James watched 3 officers position themselves around him like he'd committed murder instead of driving while black in a new truck. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so dangerous. He'd faced enemy combatants in Fallujah with less firepower pointed in his direction. Martinez asked Briggs what was going on. The sheriff's explanation made no sense even to her. Suspicious temporary registration, uncooperative driver, possible stolen vehicle. Each claim more ridiculous than the last, contradicted by the physical evidence sitting right there in James's hands. But here's what Martinez understood that Chen didn't yet. Challenging your sheriff on scene in front of a civilian wasn't how you kept your job in Brazos County. You might have questions, you might know something isn't right, but you swallow it, follow orders, and maybe bring it up later through proper channels. That's how the system works. That's how bad cops keep operating for decades. She took position and said nothing. Briggs demanded James submit to a vehicle search. James asked on what grounds, since he'd committed no crime, and the stop itself lacked reasonable suspicion. That question, that completely legal and reasonable question, was apparently the final straw. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Briggs's voice had gone cold. The dash cam captured James's expression in that moment. Not fear, not anger. Something worse. Resignation. The look of a man who'd served his country with distinction, earned medals for valor, saved lives under enemy fire, and was now being handcuffed on a Texas highway for asking a question. The metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. Standard police handcuffs, same kind used on actual criminals. They were too tight. James didn't complain. He'd been through worse in SEER school. Martinez watched this happen and felt her stomach turn. She'd seen questionable stops before. She'd witnessed Briggs push boundaries. But this was different. This was a clear violation happening right in front of her, recorded for posterity, and she was part of it now, whether she wanted to be or not. Chen, young and eager, genuinely believed they'd just arrested someone dangerous. That's what Briggs had told them. That's what the sheriff's 23 years of experience suggested. Why would he lie? James stood there, handcuffed, breathing steadily, maintaining his composure through sheer force of will. His mind was already working through what would happen next. The arrest report Briggs would file, the charges that would be fabricated, the system that would initially believe a sheriff over a black man, even one in uniform. But James had something most victims of wrongful arrest don't have: resources, knowledge, connections, and most importantly, irrefutable video evidence of every single second. What Sheriff Clayton Briggs didn't realize as he walked James toward his patrol car, what he wouldn't understand until lawyers started filing paperwork, was that he'd just made the most expensive mistake of his life. The patrol car's back seat was designed for criminals. Hard plastic molded to be just uncomfortable enough. No handles on the inside of the doors. A metal grate separating front from back. James sat perfectly still, his hands cuffed behind him, watching the Texas landscape roll past through the window. Briggs was on the radio. James could hear fragments through the grate. Subject in custody, resisting lawful commands, possible stolen vehicle investigation ongoing. Each word another lie being broadcast into the official record. Each phrase another brick in a wall of false narrative that would need to be torn down piece by piece. They pulled into the county detention center 20 minutes later. The building squatted low and gray against the afternoon sun. Briggs parked in the secure bay where suspects were processed away from public view. He opened the back door and hauled James out by his arm. The grip was unnecessarily rough. Performative force for the cameras mounted above the entrance. Inside, the booking area smelled like industrial cleaner and stale coffee. A deputy named Rodriguez sat behind bulletproof glass, processing paperwork from an earlier arrest. He looked up when Briggs walked in with James and his expression flickered. Just for a second. Surprise, maybe. Confusion. But he caught himself and went back to neutral. Briggs started rattling off charges. Resisting arrest. Failure to comply with lawful orders. Obstruction of an investigation. Rodriguez typed them into the system, his fingers moving across the keyboard in practiced rhythm. James said nothing. He'd already requested an attorney. Anything he said now would only be used against him. The booking process took 40 minutes. Fingerprints, photographs, personal property inventory. James's wallet containing his military ID, his driver's license, 3 credit cards, and $87 cash. His phone, his keys, his watch, a Tag Heuer his unit had chipped in to buy him when he made captain. Everything cataloged and sealed in a manila envelope. Rodriguez held up the military ID. Active duty? Briggs snatched it from his hand. Doesn't matter. Process him. But Rodriguez had already seen it. The ID was current. The rank was legitimate. This wasn't some kid fresh out of basic. This was a captain in the United States Army sitting in handcuffs because he'd asked questions during a traffic stop. Rodriguez didn't say anything else, but James saw him glance at the wall clock and make a note on a separate piece of paper. The timestamp. Something felt wrong to him, and he was creating his own record. James was moved to a holding cell. Concrete walls, metal bench, a toilet in the corner with no privacy. One other person occupied the space, a middle-aged man sleeping off whatever substance had landed him there. The cell door clanged shut with the particular finality that only steel on steel can produce. This was the part where most people panic, where the reality of arrest, of being caged, of having zero control crashes down. James had been trained for this. Not specifically for wrongful arrest by corrupt small-town sheriffs, but for captivity in general. He knew how to manage his mind in confined spaces. He sat on the metal bench, closed his eyes, and started running through everything that had happened in chronological order. Every word, every action, building the mental framework he'd need when lawyers started asking questions. 3 hours passed. The man on the opposite bench woke up, mumbled something incoherent, and passed out again. James remained still, patient. The door finally opened, and a different deputy appeared, taller, older, with gray at his temples. His nameplate read Foster. "You've got a phone call." James stood and followed him down a corridor to a room with a single phone mounted on the wall. Foster removed the handcuffs. "Call's private. Take your time." The door closed. James picked up the receiver and dialed his attorney, a man named Vincent Shore, who handled legal affairs for several officers at Fort Hood. The phone rang twice before Shore answered. "James? I got a very interesting call from Brazos County about 30 minutes ago." "Tell me what happened." James laid it out, factual, chronological, no emotion, just the sequence of events from the moment he saw the lights in his mirror to sitting in this room. Shore listened without interrupting. James could hear him typing notes on the other end. When James finished, there was a pause. Then Shore spoke, and his voice had changed, had an edge to it now. James, I need you to understand something. What you're describing isn't just a bad stop. This is a civil rights violation. This is deprivation of rights under color of law. This is going to be federal. I know. Do you? Because I don't think you understand how big this is about to get. This sheriff just arrested an active-duty military officer, on camera, with zero probable cause, and then filed false charges. Do you know what the DOJ does to cases like this? James didn't answer. He was starting to understand. Shore continued. I'm filing emergency motions tonight. You'll be out in a few hours. But James, this doesn't end with you walking out of that cell. This goes much further. I need you to document everything while it's fresh. Every detail. Every word he said. I'm also calling Fort Hood's legal office. Your command needs to know one of their officers is sitting in county lockup on bogus charges. The call ended. James hung up and Foster reappeared to escort him back to the cell. But something had shifted in Foster's demeanor. The way he walked. The way he held himself. Less like a corrections officer and more like someone trying to distance himself from whatever was about to happen. You need anything? Water? I'm fine. Foster nodded and locked the cell door again, but his expression suggested he knew exactly how not fine the situation actually was. James sat back down on the metal bench. The other occupant was awake now, staring at the ceiling. He glanced over at James. What'd they get you for? James considered not answering, but something about the mundane normalcy of the question made him respond. Traffic stop. The man laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the concrete. Yeah, they're good at that around here. Real good at finding reasons. Outside the cell, beyond the walls and the locked doors, Shore was already in motion. He'd pulled the dashcam footage through an emergency discovery request, claiming exigent circumstances and potential evidence tampering. It took one phone call to a judge he'd worked with before. The judge, a former Marine, expedited everything. Shore watched the footage in his office, all 43 minutes of it. His paralegal stood behind him, watching over his shoulder. Neither spoke until it ended. The paralegal broke the silence first. He's finished, the sheriff. He's completely finished. Shore nodded slowly. He wasn't just finished. This was career-ending, pension-threatening, potentially criminal charges against him territory. The footage showed everything. The lack of probable cause, the escalation, the false statements, the wrongful arrest. All of it captured in high definition with timestamps. But Shore also knew something else. Cases like this, even with perfect evidence, could take years. The system protected its own. Police unions, qualified immunity, the blue wall of silence. Briggs had 23 years on the job. He'd have support. He'd have lawyers. He'd fight this with every resource available. So Shore made another call. This one to a contact at the ACLU, then another to a civil rights attorney in Dallas who specialized in police misconduct, then a third to a journalist who'd covered similar cases. By midnight, 5 different organizations knew James's name and had copies of the footage. Back in the cell, James had no idea this machinery was already turning. He just sat there, breathing steadily, maintaining his composure. The man across from him had fallen asleep again. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the corridor, someone was yelling at a deputy about their medication. James closed his eyes and thought about his daughter. She was 7. Too young to understand why Daddy wasn't home tonight. His wife would shield her from this, come up with some explanation about work. But eventually, she'd be old enough to ask questions. Old enough to understand that her father, who served his country, who wore the uniform, who did everything right, still ended up in handcuffs on a Texas highway. That thought, more than anything else that had happened today, made James angry. Not the scared, reactive anger that gets people hurt, the cold, focused anger that sustains you through long campaigns, the kind that doesn't burn out. He opened his eyes and stared at the concrete wall. Briggs had made a mistake today. A catastrophic, career-ending, possibly life-altering mistake. And James was going to make absolutely certain everyone understood exactly what that mistake cost. Morning came with the sound of metal doors and shuffling footsteps. James hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Briggs's face. That smirk. That absolute certainty that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. A deputy James hadn't seen before unlocked the cell. Breakfast trays were distributed on plastic traps. Powdered eggs, gray meat that might have been sausage, toast that bent like rubber. James ate mechanically, forcing down the calories. He'd learned in the military that you eat when food is available. You never know when the next meal is coming. 2 hours later, another deputy arrived. This one was older, probably close to retirement. His name tag read Sullivan. He told James he was being transferred to county for arraignment. The process was slow and deliberate. More paperwork, more waiting. James was handcuffed again, the metal biting into his wrists in exactly the same spots as yesterday. The bruises were already forming, dark purple rings around both wrists. Sullivan noticed but said nothing. The transport van was cramped and hot. 3 other people were already inside, separated by metal mesh. Nobody spoke. The drive took 40 minutes through flat Texas countryside. Strip malls gave way to fields, then back to developed areas as they approached the county seat. The courthouse was a massive concrete structure that looked like it had been built in the 70s and never updated. Beige walls, narrow windows, American flag hanging limp in the still morning air. James was processed again. Different facility, same routine. Fingerprints even though they already had them. Photograph even though they already took one. More questions even though he'd answered them all yesterday. The system grinding forward with bureaucratic indifference. He was placed in a holding cell with about 15 other people, all waiting for their turn before the judge. Some looked terrified. Others looked bored, like they'd been through this enough times that it no longer registered as remarkable. Shore arrived at the courthouse an hour before James's scheduled arraignment. He'd brought 2 associates and enough documentation to fill a briefcase. The dashcam footage was loaded on a tablet, ready to play. He'd also brought something else. A letter from James's commanding officer, written overnight and expedited through military channels. It detailed James's service record, his deployments, his commendations, his character. Shore knew it wouldn't matter for the legal arguments, but it would matter for optics. And in cases like this, optics mattered almost as much as the law. The arraignment was scheduled for 10:30. By 10:15, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread somehow, maybe through Shore's calls last night, maybe through social media, maybe just through the network of people who paid attention to these things. The gallery was filled with observers, some taking notes, others just watching. James recognized the type: activists, journalists, people who showed up when the system needed witnesses. Judge Catherine Reeves took the bench at exactly 10:30. She was in her late 50s, appointed rather than elected, with a reputation for running an efficient courtroom. She looked at the docket, then looked at the prosecutor, then looked at Shore. Her expression suggested she already knew this wasn't going to be a standard proceeding. The prosecutor stood first. His name was Glenn Porter, an assistant district attorney who'd been handling arraignments for 6 years. He began outlining the charges against James: evading arrest, resisting an officer, failure to comply with lawful orders. His voice was steady, professional, reading from prepared notes like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Shore stood when it was his turn. He didn't use notes. He spoke directly to Judge Reeves, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He outlined the timeline of yesterday's stop, the lack of probable cause, the escalating demands, the threats. He mentioned the dashcam footage and offered to play it right there in open court. Judge Reeves held up a hand. She said she'd review the footage in chambers before making any determinations. She asked Porter if the state had seen the footage. Porter hesitated. That hesitation told everyone in the courtroom everything they needed to know. He hadn't seen it. The sheriff's department hadn't provided it to the prosecutor's office. They'd arrested James, filed charges, and moved forward without bothering to review their own evidence. Judge Reeves's expression changed. Not dramatically, just a slight tightening around her eyes. She called a recess and requested both attorneys in her chambers immediately. James was led back to the holding cell. He sat on the concrete bench and waited. Around him, other defendants whispered to each other, speculating about what was happening. One man, probably in his early 20s, asked James what he'd done. James didn't answer. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. James counted the tiles on the floor. 87 visible from where he sat. He counted them 3 times to make sure. When the deputies finally came to retrieve him, their demeanor had changed. Not friendly, but different. More careful. They brought him back to the courtroom where Judge Reeves was already seated. Shore was at the defense table, his expression neutral, but his posture relaxed. Porter stood at the prosecution table, looking like someone had just told him his house was on fire. Judge Reeves spoke directly to James. She informed him that all charges were being dismissed without prejudice. She said the court had reviewed the evidence and determined there was insufficient basis to proceed. She also said something else. She was referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for review of potential civil rights violations. The words hung in the air like smoke. James felt Shore's hand on his shoulder, a brief squeeze of reassurance. The judge continued. She stated for the record that the court found serious concerns about the conduct of the arresting officer. She noted that the dashcam footage raised questions about training, supervision, and departmental policies. She said these concerns extended beyond this single incident and warranted comprehensive investigation. Every word was being transcribed by the court reporter. Every word would become part of the permanent record. Every word was another nail in Briggs' professional coffin. Porter tried to salvage something. He stood and requested the dismissal be with prejudice, meaning the charges could never be refiled. Judge Reeves denied the request. She said the state needed to determine whether the evidence supported different charges against different defendants. The implication was clear. Maybe James shouldn't be charged. Maybe someone else should be. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Reeves gavelled for order, then dismissed the proceeding. James walked out of the courthouse 20 minutes later, a free man for the first time in 18 hours. The sunlight felt aggressive after the fluorescent gloom of cells and courtrooms. Shore stood beside him on the courthouse steps, fielding questions from reporters who'd gathered outside. James said nothing. He just stood there, blinking in the bright Texas sun, trying to process that this part was over. But he knew it wasn't really over. This was just the beginning. Shore drove James back to the impound lot where his truck had been towed. The fees were astronomical. $217 for the tow, $90 per day for storage, administrative fees, processing fees, fees for fees. James paid with a credit card, each swipe feeling like another small injustice. His truck started on the first try. He sat in the driver's seat, hands on the steering wheel, staring through the windshield at nothing in particular. Shore tapped on the window. James rolled it down. We're filing the lawsuit tomorrow. Federal court. Civil rights violations, unlawful arrest, false imprisonment, emotional distress. We're also filing a formal complaint with the State Police Oversight Board and requesting a Department of Justice investigation into the department's practices. Shore's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. This is going to get ugly. They're going to fight. They're going to try to destroy your credibility. They're going to dig into every aspect of your life looking for ammunition. You need to be ready for that. James nodded slowly. He understood. He'd seen how institutions protected themselves, how they circled the wagons and attacked anyone who threatened their authority, how they turned victims into villains through carefully crafted narratives and selective evidence. But he also knew something Briggs and the Sheriff's Department didn't. He'd been trained to withstand pressure. He'd operated in environments where mistakes meant death. He'd maintained composure under circumstances that would break most people. A smear campaign from a rural Texas Sheriff's Department wasn't going to rattle him. Shore seemed to read his thoughts. He nodded once, a gesture of respect between people who understood what real combat looked like. Then he walked back to his own car. James drove home slowly, obeying every traffic law with meticulous precision. Every stop sign was a complete stop. Every turn signal activated exactly when required. Every speed limit followed to the letter. He felt eyes on him the whole way. Probably paranoia. Probably just residual hypervigilance from yesterday. But maybe not. Maybe every cop in the county now knew his face, his truck, his license plate. Maybe he was marked. The thought didn't scare him. It made him angry again. That cold, focused anger that didn't fade. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday morning in federal court. Shore didn't hold a press conference, but he didn't need to. The complaint was public record, and by noon, 3 news outlets had published stories with headlines that made the sheriff's department sound exactly as corrupt as they were. The document was 93 pages of methodical legal destruction. It named Officer Briggs, Sheriff Coleman, the department itself, and the county as defendants. It detailed every moment of the traffic stop, the illegal search, the fabricated arrest, the coordinated false testimony. It included timestamps from the dashcam footage that hadn't been released publicly yet. It quoted the audio of Briggs discussing how to justify the arrest after the fact. It presented evidence of a pattern. Turns out James wasn't the first person Briggs had targeted. Shore's investigators had found 7 other cases in the past 4 years where Briggs made arrests that were later dismissed or reduced to nothing. All 7 involved Black or Hispanic drivers. All 7 involved searches that found nothing illegal. All 7 resulted in people spending hours or days in custody before being released without charges or with charges that vanished mysteriously. The lawsuit demanded compensatory damages, punitive damages, legal fees, and a federal consent decree forcing the department to reform its practices under court supervision. The number attached to the demand was substantial. $3.7 million. The county's insurance carrier received the complaint and immediately contacted their lawyers. By Friday afternoon, those lawyers were in emergency meetings trying to assess their exposure. Their conclusion was grim. The dashcam footage alone made this case almost impossible to defend. The audio of Briggs and the other officer discussing how to justify the arrest was catastrophic. The pattern evidence suggested institutional problems that went beyond one bad cop. If this went to trial, a jury would eviscerate them. Monday morning, the sheriff's department held a press conference. Sheriff Coleman stood at a podium looking like a man who'd aged 10 years over the weekend. He announced that Officer Briggs had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. He said the department took allegations of misconduct seriously and was committed to transparency and accountability. He said he couldn't comment on pending litigation, but assured the public that his department operated with integrity. The reporters didn't buy it. They asked pointed questions about the pattern of dismissed cases. They asked why Briggs was still employed if the evidence was so damning. They asked if the sheriff planned to resign. Coleman deflected, repeated his prepared statements, and left without answering most of the questions. The internal investigation was a joke. Everyone involved knew it. Internal investigations almost always were. The investigator assigned was a sergeant who'd worked alongside Briggs for 6 years. The interviews were cursory. The conclusions were predetermined. 3 weeks later, the department announced that while Officer Briggs had made errors in judgment, there was insufficient evidence of intentional wrongdoing. He would receive additional training and return to duty with restrictions on conducting traffic stops without backup. Shore received the report and laughed out loud when he read it. He filed a supplemental complaint in federal court, arguing that the sham investigation proved the department's institutional corruption. He requested the judge expedite discovery so they could depose Briggs, Coleman, and every officer involved before the department could coordinate their stories further. The judge, a Carter appointee with a reputation for not tolerating law enforcement misconduct, granted the request. Depositions were scheduled for 6 weeks out. During those 6 weeks, James tried to resume normal life. He went back to work at the construction company, but the arrest had changed things. His supervisor was supportive, but some coworkers treated him differently, like he was fragile or dangerous, or both. One guy actually asked if James was going to sue them too. The paranoia about being targeted by police never fully disappeared. Every time James drove anywhere, he watched his mirrors obsessively. Every patrol car he saw sent his heart rate spiking. He started taking different routes to avoid certain roads. He installed a second dash cam facing backward. The psychological toll was heavier than he'd expected. He found himself having trouble sleeping. When he did sleep, he dreamed about being handcuffed, about metal bars, about officers laughing while planting evidence. He started researching therapists who specialized in trauma but didn't actually call any of them. Admitting he needed help felt like giving Briggs another victory. Then the deposition started. Shore brought in an associate to help with the questioning. They spent 12 hours over 3 days deposing Briggs, and the officer fell apart spectacularly. Under oath, confronted with his own recorded words, and caught in multiple contradictions, Briggs couldn't maintain his story. He claimed he couldn't remember specific details. He blamed his training. He suggested James must have seemed suspicious for reasons he couldn't articulate. He denied racial bias while simultaneously describing his approach to traffic stops in ways that revealed obvious bias. Shore was relentless. He walked Briggs through every second of the encounter, forcing him to explain each decision. Why this car? Why this justification? Why search without consent? Why arrest for a non-existent warrant? The officer's answers became increasingly incoherent. At one point, Briggs actually said he felt threatened by James's military bearing. A decorated veteran sitting calmly in his truck was threatening because he sat up straight. The absurdity was documented in the deposition transcript for posterity. Sheriff Coleman's deposition was worse for the defense. He admitted under questioning that he'd received complaints about Briggs before. He acknowledged that the pattern of dismissed cases should have triggered review. He confirmed that departmental policy required supervisory approval for searches without consent, which Briggs had never obtained. He tried to defend his decision to support Briggs initially, but his explanation sounded hollow even to him. Shore asked one question that Coleman couldn't answer satisfactorily. If you believed Officer Briggs acted appropriately, why did you personally call the prosecutor to suggest dropping charges? Coleman stammered something about wanting to avoid unnecessary legal expenses. Shore let the answer hang there, speaking volumes through silence. The prosecutor who dropped the charges was deposed next. She was professional and careful, but her testimony was devastating for the defense. She confirmed that after reviewing the dashcam footage, she'd determined there was no probable cause for the arrest. She stated that she'd found the officer's justifications inconsistent with the evidence. She acknowledged that she'd recommended the county settle any potential civil suit quickly because their position was indefensible. 2 weeks after the depositions concluded, the county's lawyers requested a settlement conference. Shore agreed immediately. He knew what this meant. They were ready to pay. The settlement conference took place in a windowless room at the federal courthouse. James sat beside Shore at one table. Across from them sat 3 lawyers representing the county, the department, and the insurance carrier. A magistrate judge facilitated. The county opened with an offer of $200,000 in exchange for releasing all claims and signing a non-disclosure agreement. Shore rejected it without consulting James. The number was insulting, and the NDA was a non-starter. They went back and forth for 6 hours. The county gradually increased their offer. $300,000, $450,000, $600,000. Each time, Shore countered higher, and each time, he refused any agreement that included a confidentiality clause. James needed to be able to tell his story. The public needed to know what happened. Sunlight was the only disinfectant that mattered. By late afternoon, exhaustion was setting in. The magistrate called a break and spoke privately with each side. When they reconvened, the county put their final offer on the table. $1.2 million. No NDA. Briggs would be terminated. The department would implement mandatory bias training and reform its search and arrest policies under independent oversight. James would receive a written apology from Sheriff Coleman. Shore looked at James. The decision was his. James thought about the 18 hours in custody, the humiliation, the fear, the anger that still hadn't fully dissipated. He thought about the 7 other people Briggs had done this to. He thought about how many more there might be that they hadn't found. 1.2 million wouldn't undo what happened. Money never could. But it would send a message. It would make other departments think twice. It would cost the people who'd violated his rights something real. James nodded once. Shore accepted the offer. The settlement was finalized 3 weeks later. James received a check that changed his financial situation permanently. He paid off his truck, his mother's house, every debt he'd accumulated. He put the rest in investments Shore's office recommended. Briggs was fired 2 days after the settlement was signed. No ceremony, no announcement, just a termination letter and an escort out of the building. He tried to appeal through his union, but even they couldn't defend what the depositions had revealed. Sheriff Coleman announced his retirement 4 months later, citing health reasons. Everyone knew the real reason. The Department of Justice opened a pattern and practice investigation into the Sheriff's Department based on the evidence from James's case. That investigation was still ongoing, but preliminary findings suggested systemic problems that would require years of federal oversight to correct. James never went back to construction. He used part of the settlement money to enroll in college, studying criminal justice. His plan was to understand the system from the inside, then work to change it. Maybe become a lawyer himself eventually. Maybe just an advocate. He hadn't decided yet. What he had decided was that what happened to him couldn't just be about money and revenge. It had to mean something larger. It had to prevent the next person from experiencing what he'd experienced. The anger had transformed into purpose. On a warm evening 6 months after the settlement, James drove past the spot where Briggs had pulled him over. He didn't slow down or stop. He just drove past, noting it without emotion, and continued toward wherever he was headed next. That stretch of highway looks the same as it did the day Briggs pulled him over. The asphalt still bakes under the Texas sun. Cars still roll past at 70 miles per hour, drivers never knowing what happened on this particular patch of road. Nothing marks the spot. No memorial, no sign. Just another piece of American highway where someone's life got turned inside out because a man with a badge decided that authority trumped humanity. James thinks about that sometimes when he's sitting in his criminal justice classes. Thinks about how many other spots like that exist across the country. How many other people got handcuffed for nothing? How many didn't have dash cams or lawyers or the resources to fight back? The system worked for him, eventually, but only because he could force it to work. That realization sits heavy. Briggs is working security at a shopping mall now, last anyone heard. Coleman plays golf and collects his pension. The department operates under federal oversight, which means more paperwork and training sessions that officers sit through while checking their phones. Change happens slowly when it happens at all. But that $1.2 million sent a message that reverberated beyond Brazos County. It showed up in training materials. It got cited in other civil rights cases. It became the example of what happens when the system actually holds people accountable for abusing their power. Not justice exactly. More like a warning that sometimes, occasionally, the cost of racism and corruption becomes too high to ignore. James still checks his mirrors obsessively when he drives. Still feels his pulse spike when he sees patrol cars. The settlement paid for therapy, which helps, but some things don't heal completely. They just become part of who you are, scars you carry forward. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there. Can't shut your mind off. And the next day, you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills, no apps, no gadgets. Just a step-by-step plan that actually works. It's only $15. I put the link in the description if you want to check it out. All right, I'll catch you in the next one.
Welcome back. We are here to relentlessly pursue the truth and hold those in power accountable. Because while words can be twisted, the records simply do not lie. Thank you for joining us today.